Hello and welcome to this John Singer Sargent Master Study tutorial. Of course, the image that we're going to be working with today is John Singer Sargent's portrait of Lady Agnew of Lochnaw. It's arguably one of his most well-known portraits, probably a little bit less so than Madame X, but a little bit more favored by the community of artists that have always really revered John Singer Sargent. I want to mention right off the top a couple things about how we're going to be doing this study, and the concepts that we're going to be focusing on to help us extract as much information and experience from this project as possible. First and foremost, when you talk about Sargent, you're going to hear about his brushwork. And while his brushwork is amazing, and definitely I aspire to some of the creativity and panache that he showed, I also think that brushwork is a lot like handwriting, in that it's an incredibly personal and improvised thing. So in this endeavor, I don't really want to copy exactly all of his brushstrokes. I am going to be looking into how he solved things with a single brushstroke rather than a lot of complicated rendering. Probably the simplest way I can describe my approach is that I'm going to be respecting, admiring, and aspiring to his brushwork, but not copying it stroke for stroke. The second thing that I want to bring up is that we are trying to take Sargent's genius and transport that into our own process and into our own understanding, rather than perhaps walking a mile in his shoes. With that in mind, I'm going to be using the palette that I always use for my own portraits, rather than adapting myself to the palette that Sargent would have used when painting this. While this can seem like an enormous difference, in fact, what we're trying to do is to simply stick with the properties of the oil paint colors that we already know and use in the rest of our work, and adapt them to Sargent's changes in hue, value, and chroma. We're going to start out this master copy by doing a block in graphite on this canvas that I have in front of me here. The reason that we're going to do this is because it's very important to attain the proportions and design of the portrait that we're going to make before we actually get into oil paint and color, because by the time we're there, we're going to want to give 100% of our attention to the incredibly subtle shifts in hue, value, and chroma that we notice in Sargent's portrait. To make this block in, I'm using a 2H graphite pencil and also a kneaded rubber eraser from Prismacolor. It's also entirely likely that I'm going to use a little bit of this paper stump just to block in maybe some of the major value planes that I think are important to indicate the volume of the head. Because I'm not going to be doing a painting of the entire picture of Lady Agnew, I'm really just focusing in on the face. I want to make sure that I have enough room to express the subtleness of the features of this model. So I'm trying to now kind of organize it in such a way where I understand maybe where the top of her hairline is versus where her chin is, and that's going to indicate to me the size of head that I'm going to be able to paint. I'd like it, I think, to be a little bit bigger than this. I think that's a little bit too small, so I'm going to keep moving her chin down to give me that extra room that I'm kind of looking for. It's always the time that you spend like in these moments that is going to kind of dictate to you how easily you can move forward, essentially. You know, if I breeze past this, that's one of those things where later I'm going to get into my painting, and I'm going to be really enthusiastic about it. I'm going to find out that I don't have enough room to express all the kind of wonderful things that I wanted to figure out when I started this project to begin with. I'm using now this kind of measurement of the hair from the very top of the hair down to the hairline as a kind of unit of measurement to kind of figure out how many of those are going to kind of fit into the face. So I'm comparing that here, and I'm comparing that on my source image as well. So there are basically about 2 units of this measurement inside the portrait. So I'm going to take that measurement and I'm going to compare that to the space on my canvas, and I think that gives me a pretty decent kind of sized head to paint. Now, it's going to mean that I'm not going to get very far down the canvas with the rest of what I'm painting, but at the very least, I'm going to get enough space for that portrait, which is really, that's why we're here, right? Now, I also know that her head is roughly a little bit less wide than 2 of these units, and so I'm going to take this 2-unit measurement here, and I'm going to use that to help kind of indicate what the overall width of the head is and center that inside my canvas. Now remember, it's a little bit less, so I've got to kind of make an approximate version of this. I think it's about that much less. So I'm going to try I'm going to try my best to kind of use that as kind of measurement to give me the shape that her head's going to take and the space it's going to take up. And I'm going to measure then also the spaces to the left and right, because for me, for this study anyway, I wanted to be almost directly in the center of my picture. So I think I need to actually just shift her over a little bit to get her centered. This always, by the way, is a very important kind of part of the process, which is to say, kind of placing everything on the canvas. You can make mistakes now because we're in this place of like total abstraction. You can make a lot of errors now that are going to impact necessarily like what you're doing later. And this isn't even just for a study. And you can see just by the way how careful I'm being. Just to do a painted study of this head. Imagine if it was a composition that I was working really hard on. You know, actually these are going to be really important moments to make sure that I don't kind of run afoul of the proportions of the head. I think at the moment though I can probably get a head kind of roughly in place here, just to give myself the most kind of general idea. And there I've got, tentatively, mind you, I've got the placement of Lady Agnew's head on the canvas. And I think that's going to give me a lot of space to kind of work on those really subtle and amazing features. I'm looking over the source image right now, and just every brush stroke and every color value there was just pulsating. And naturally, I feel a little bit intimidated by it. But I think that's okay. You know, I mean, when you're kind of in the presence of greatness. Now, she is looking just about right at us. And you can see that, you know, there's a few ways you can kind of understand that. Partly, you can look at how much of each ear we're seeing. And you can understand that actually we're seeing the same amount, an equivalent amount of each ear, here and here. And because of that, we understand she's looking right at us. So all of the spaces to the left of her eyes, to the right of her eyes, to the right of her mouth, to the left of her mouth, those should all be relatively equidistant. Speaking of which, let's find the center point in the face to see kind of where that center line is going to be. And to do that, I'm just going to actually kind of make a mark, and then I'm going to remeasure based on that mark. So I think the center line of her face is right about there. And I'm judging that by looking at the contour on the right and the contour on the left and the distance that they are to this center line. So I think that puts me right about in the middle. I'm going to kind of start to mark her brow as well. Again, this is a moment, you know, we're talking about making big observations. We're not doing anything subtle. I just want to dial in the proportions so that when I'm trying to get that one brush stroke that defines the highlight on the forehead, that the forehead is the right size and the right shape. And I'm going to get these eyebrows dialed in because they're such a characteristic feature. I feel like they, more than anything, really help to kind of create the shape of the forehead. So I'm going to put a slightly higher visual priority on them. I'm also searching for where the neck comes out. I always find this is a really delicate process because when you're unsure of exactly what the shape of the line of the jaw is, kind of placing the neck inside of that can be difficult. So I'm going to make my first good guess at it. And that, by the way, of course, is something that you should take into account when you're making this block in, is that this is your first best guess. This is not anything that we're going to call definite or certain. You know, we really want to stay flexible at this point. I mean, really, the only major caution that I have to give you in this moment is, you know, the worst thing that you could do is kind of lock yourself in to the earliest shapes that you choose, you know. Give yourself the time to reflect, give yourself the time to observe, to step back from your subject. I'll probably block in as well, I think, some of the shadow shapes. You can see I've started to indicate here a little bit the shadow shapes on the side of the face. Wherever it's useful, I have a bit of a utilitarian feeling about, you know, the kind of stages of a painting or stages of a drawing. I feel like if you can make a good argument that something is going to be useful, then I say you take it. I say go for it. Because essentially that's what we're doing here. We're really just trying to problem solve. We're trying to figure out how to how to get a recognizable, image of this model, of this subject, kind of translated onto our canvas. And, starting from scratch, I feel like we're in a little bit of a anything goes kind of place, right? If you find it useful, dive in, use it. I can recall students asking, is it okay to put in value now? Can I put in value in the drawing? As if there was some boundary past which it was allowed then to use value. The only boundary is the utility of something, right? Would it be more or less beneficial to do this now? That's the question to ask. Right now, I think it would actually just create a little bit of a mess to put a bunch of value in this, because the value doesn't have any shapes to sit inside. Once the shapes are established and we have some clear sense of, kind of shape structure within the piece, you would then say, well, maybe now there's a utility to putting in that value. So I'm always waiting for the moment when it becomes useful to do something. So I've got at least something that looks a bit like a head blocked in. So I feel pretty good about that. We've got a long way to go, though, before we say that we're ready to start with oil paint. I'm going to, place all the features. I think this is kind of, what I really like to do is I like to place the features, get a good hypothetical idea of where they are, and then kind of go through and take some, more kind of clear measurements, right? I think there's this balance that I always talk about that we want to create in between measuring and drawing. Look at this. I've made that mouth way too close to the nose. It's got to be too close. Need to lower that. Then I'm going to go through and double check, because you want your drawing to be a good mixture of intuition, which is what your eyes are kind of telling you when you observe your subject, and accountable, academic type measurements and observations. So a good balance in between those two is going to make for a drawing that has accuracy but also has character. I think that's the sweet spot that we are aiming for in terms of where we would like our end result to be. So remember, always cross-referencing. Actually, this angle break and this one are almost directly across from each other. So that's really rather convenient. And then I can see, like, where does this one end becomes a big question mark for me. So I'm going to try and triangulate based upon where it kind of aligns with the ear. So I see that it aligns somewhere about here. And that's where I should expect to find the beginning of that sleeve of the dress. Kind of pops up from there. You can see that also kind of creates this little negative shape through here as well, which to me at the moment, I feel like that negative shape looks a little bit wide. I feel like my neck maybe is a little bit narrow. I'm going to bring that out further. Now you're probably seeing this take me maybe 15, maybe 20 minutes. What should it take you at home? I think you should be rather rapid in terms of like how you actually get the head placed on the canvas. I feel like a good block in, just getting everything on the paper. By the way, block in, let's just say, block in doesn't mean that the first stage is finished. It means the first stage is started. So what should it take you to like start your first stage? I would say probably 25 minutes. That's what I used to give my students at the academy in terms of like getting the entire subject roughly placed on the canvas or on the page. That means that you're dealing with big things, and I think that time limit, in a sense, it keeps you focused on the right kind of information. Like if you had 45 minutes to do to start your block in, I feel like you're going to get into things that require a little bit more measurement. You're going to get into things that are a little bit more specific. There's going to be all sorts of things that kind of come out of that. So I say take it a little bit faster. Get this onto the page in about 25 minutes, and then see where you're ready to go after that. Maybe I'll venture into a little bit of shadow shape through here. I want you to be careful establishing your shadow shapes. There's this temptation to want to kind of outline your shadows in order to be precise about them. I think that I would much rather you kept those a little bit more open. You can see that the kind of marks that I'm making here are in no way indicative of an outline of the shadow exactly. We need to stay a little bit broad there, because these are going to be really turning edges. They're going to be really softly kind of turning edges, and if we put that kind of fine a point on it, I feel like eventually it's gonna have a negative, an adverse effect on this when we paint. So I've got a bit of graphite in my stump here. I'm just going through and kind of very lightly indicating, you know, some of the shadow values. You can see how that starts to lift the light shape out from the shadows. And I'm just trying to engage maybe just a little bit more. You know, my naive observation. I want to use my eyes to take some measurements and some observations here. And yeah, see if I can get this portrait to be momentarily just a tiny bit more recognizable. You can see there's that little bit of gesture in the eyebrows. I mean, it's one of the things, right, that makes this portrait eventually so stunning, is that like look in our eyes. And a lot of our expression actually comes from eyebrows. It comes from the things around our actual eyeballs, the shape of our eyelids, how much we're exposing actually of the kind of white or of our eye, or even the iris and pupil. These are really kind of expressive aspects that have their roots still at this stage of the drawing. Now the nose is a place where some of the finer margins need to be attended to. You know, you don't want to wind up starting out with a feature here that's too big. It's just a really easy place to kind of mess up, and so I tend to want to really double check, really kind of triple check what's happening with my proportions there. You want to remember that when you're going to block this stuff in, this is just going to be big brush strokes. You're not going to be fiddling around with, you know, tiny shapes as you kind of start blocking in this head. It's going to be pretty direct. So try to think in terms of like what brushstroke size you'd be indicating something with. And by that I mean, try not to draw shapes that you couldn't indicate really, really simply. Now eventually when the time comes, we're just going to spray fix all this. We use something called SpectraFix, which is a milk enzyme based fixative that doesn't really disrupt or interrupt the adhesion of the paint to the surface or to the substrate here. So whatever graphite that I put on now isn't going to be kind of pulled up into the paint film that I'm applying, or at the very least there'll be a very minimal amount of it that gets pulled up. Again, these are some of the areas where for sure I'm not really going to be so concerned with Sargent's brushwork. Like you can see, and this is maybe a great moment to point this out before we even start painting. Looking at this area of the shoulder through here, on Sargent's portrait, there's not really a lot of rhyme or reason to the arrangement of strokes there. It's very much an improvisation, and this is something you'll notice if you really start studying Sargent's work quite well. Though the necessary parts are very accurate, the parts which are, as he deems them, out of focus or down prioritized in terms of their importance visually, the rendering drops off a cliff, and you get into places where the brushstrokes are just swirling around. So rather than try to copy the swirling improvisation of his hand, I'm going to look at the colors and the values and the kind of spirit of how those areas were painted, try to simplify them with my own improvisations that hopefully come close to matching the clarity of his. This is a hairline that I feel like I've been studying for as long as I've been painting. You know, when I tell students, don't make your hairlines sharp, this is the painting that I'm always thinking of. This is the one that is exactly what comes up in my memory. When you see the sense that the forehead just flows underneath the hair, underneath the hair into the scalp, you know, all the way around to the back of the head. That's what this hairline is telling you. And I of course have simplified it here into this sort of really, you know, ridiculous just outline of an edge. I mean, the reality is we're probably going to be like going over that area with our finger, kind of smudging that and trying to just get that level of kind of, you know, softness in comparison to, say, the crispness of an edge like this of the jaw. I mean, look at the variation in between those two edges. It's immense. One of the things you want to also be really aware of is that we have certain tendencies kind of based on psychology. Like we tend to make the eyes like a little bit larger than they actually are, because we're so kind of intent upon them. We see so much personality there. We give a lot of attention to them, and they kind of get a little bit outsized proportionally. So something I try and like kind of double check, and maybe add a little bit more, you know, kind of work a little bit more detail to the eyes, just so I kind of know that liability, you know, is kind of taken care of or is focused on in a way that is going to ensure that I don't leave it as kind of a blind spot, you know. You should be starting by this point to get some small sense of like the intensity of her gaze, right? Like this is, speaking to the power of the pose. Like this is already just so living. And it has very little to do with the meager effort that I've put forth here. It's just a fantastic pose. It's a fantastic composition. It's a really, really crisply realized personality that Sargent has brought to us here. There's something else I want to be aware of here is I don't want to leave too many kind of awkward linear boundaries where visually they're not actually happening in the portrait. Like here, listen, we don't see anything of that line. I mean, the most that we're gonna get is the ghost of a value change there. In fact, probably 99% of what makes this her chest and this her dress is just a shift in hue from yellow to purple. So if I leave some big carved in line through there, that's gonna be a problem later. So I'm gonna try to kind of remove a little bit, or at least diminish in their presence some of these areas that I just feel like they don't show up. They don't show up as boundaries, as edges in between values. And having some of them is fine, whatever, we don't have to. We're gonna paint this, so it's not as if the onus is completely on our drawing to become, the very real version of her. But we just don't want to leave things that kind of stand in the way. Which, by the way, let's just say also, I was going to save this statement for the beginning of the painting section, when it would become even more pronounced and more evident. I will not match up to Sargent's amazing portrait here. My copy of it will be like an echo of the sound that this one makes, diminished naturally. And that's okay. Again, because I want to learn from Sargent. I don't necessarily expect this to be a believable forgery, or something that you would not recognize to be made by somebody else's hand. For me, it's the learning. I'm going to try my best to match up to what he's done, but the likelihood is, that my painting, our paintings, right, will be a little bit the echo of Sargent's painting, and that's okay. We need to. I say this so that we can stay a little bit realistic about what our goals are, and understand what the return on this investment of our time actually will be. It'll be lessons. Now again, all this stuff that's happening back here, I mean, I may only make a passing allusion to that in the actual painting of this. These brushstrokes, these red brushstrokes here, some of these flicking highlights through here, again, they're just not so significant to me. A lot of painters left brushstrokes on a canvas. This is not the qualitative thing that draws me to this portrait. It's much more what's happening in here. So very likely this will stay as a kind of a block-in at most, and I'll spend all of my kind of time and attention here to make this as hopefully faithful a rendering as possible to Sargent's original. Well, I think we're going to call this section of the project done. I've made some measurements, I've double-checked, I've triple-checked. I feel pretty confident about the sense of proportion that I have, characterization of the light shapes. At the very least, I feel good about them in terms of where I'm going to establish my initial masses of color and value. That's going to be enough to get me into the painting section of this, where my design is only going to be enhanced and increased in terms of its push or its movement towards being in a place that's actually accurate. I need more stuff happening on the canvas to be more faithful to what I'm actually seeing. So I'm going to leave the graphite here. Again, this is also because I don't want to start overstating my graphite drawing. I want it to be simple. I want it to be light. I want it to look like it just drifted onto the surface of the canvas, and that going over it with paint will be no problem whatsoever. What I want you to recall when you're working on your projects in your studio is this: the basic proportions need to be derived from this moment. So ask yourself, what is the distance from the top of the head to the hairline, and how many of those distances fit into the face that we're seeing. Then, how many of those distances fit into the width of the face that we're seeing. This is the basic hunt for proportions that's going to get you to a place where your block-in has a believable likeness that doesn't have all of the bells and whistles and specificity that the final painting has, but it has that, 30 meters away kind of accuracy that we need to have at this stage in order to progress. The other thing I want you to think about is your drawing complete? Have you shown all of the features and everything kind of at the same level? At least everything that's important, right? I mentioned out here, these are going to be, things that are barely painted. They're peripheral. All of my energy and attention and focus is going to be here. I'm not going to indicate maybe the exact shapes of some of these characters out here. I might find some color notes, but most of the design is going to take place in the central area, and that's where I want to give all of my attention, and so I can let the drawing fall away a little bit at these edges. But is your drawing through here complete? Have you checked? Have you double checked? Have you triangulated to find where these points are? Compared them across the form to each other. Check those angles. Check the angles that shoot from side to side. Where does this trapezius, right? Where does that point to on the figure? These are the kinds of things that you can observe and you can measure. Right? And they can all help you kind of triangulate on this 2D surface and get a little bit more of an accurate block in so that when you paint, you're not going to be making a lot of changes.